On the phone with us this morning, Congressman Tracy Mann. Good morning, Congressman.
Good morning. How are you?
Well, it's been interesting, but that's true for you as well. Let's talk about what's going on in Washington as the legislative process. You want to be sure that things continue to happen the way they need to for particularly agricultural producers. You and Representative Davis from North Carolina introducing some legislation about precision agriculture. And let me explain for the layman kind of what that is. The combines don't run based on how straight Grandpa can drive them anymore, do they, Tracy?
Well, that's exactly right. And our family's farm and many farms all over Kansas switched to precision agriculture as equipment became more sophisticated here quite some time ago. In some ways, though, the regulation and rules have been slower to catch up. And I think we got to acknowledge that our ag producers are some of the most sophisticated business people in the world. The equipment they're operating, the businesses that they run. And this helps to do that. Another thing we've been working on, Nick, is working to make sure the president can't do away with the stepped-up basis and other important tax provisions for our ag producers in our great state.
Well, and let's explain once again what the stepped-up basis is, just because if you don't own a farm or your folks haven't passed recently, you may not know what that means. That's a tax thing.
Yeah, and this impacts our ag producers. It also impacts small business owners as well. So the ability, though, to pass farmland from one generation to the next with a step up or an increase in the tax basis is huge from a state tax planning purpose. Agriculture is often a very capital-intensive industry. And so, this has been the law of the land for decades, Nick. It's a really important tax tool. President Biden's budget that he released, though, proposed doing away with the stepped-up basis. And so I introduced legislation to make sure that we preserve it. Actually released that legislation last week on National Agriculture Day. We have broad bipartisan support. We have Republicans also, quite a few Democrats on this legislation as well. But this is another example, something that we got to make sure we prevent Washington, D.C. from doing to our ag producers in our great state.
All right. So there are all kinds of things that have been going on in that regard. This seems like a constant drumbeat from the Biden administration, though, because it's a way to getting rid of the stepped-up basis is, well, I'm not just going to say in effect. It's a tax increase if you do it.
It's absolutely a tax increase. So understand what this is. So the president releases their budget every spring. And in this budget that President Biden released earlier this month, it is much more spending, and it also raises our taxes. So this is another tax and spend bill. We're at $32 trillion in debt already, Nick. And then, how are we going to pay for all the spending? Yeah, tax increases like the stepped-up basis. Another tax that's proposed in this budget is, we call it the farm killer tax. But for any farmland owned by a family for 90 years or more, there would be a one-time capital gains tax true-up in the year 2030. So think about that. All our multi-generational family farms that have been in the family since 1940, come 2030, so in 8 years from now, would have a massive tax bill that would hit them out of the blue. These are the kind of things that, they would not be game changers. They'd be game enders for our great farmers all over our districts who are working to make sure they get them killed and that never, ever happens.
All right. So, and this is not new stuff. They tried to do this last year because, frankly, Tracy, I won an award for a story on this a year ago. So this isn't new information. This is just coming back and trying again.
Well, that's exactly right. So this is President Biden's third budget, and this is the third time that he has proposed eliminating the stepped-up basis and also implementing the farm killer tax. So we jumped up and down. We passed a resolution. We did a bunch of things to kill this bad notion the last two go-arounds, and now we've got to be back at it again because, unfortunately, the administration hasn't gotten the message that this would be devastating and is something that we don't want to do.
Well, are there any Democrats joining you on this? Because it feels like you need somebody from his own corner to say, hey, this just isn't going to work.
Yeah, there are. So the resolution that we submitted last week to preserve the stepped-up basis, we have a bunch of co-sponsors, several Democrats as well. So we have bipartisan pushback on the administration for this really, really bad idea.
All right. Also, the FAA is getting ready to do its reauthorization, and so that gives you a chance to ask questions about some of the things that have happened at that agency lately, like antiquated computer systems causing everybody to have flight delays here a few months back, those kind of things. That's what Congress does when they go through the appropriations process, is ask these kinds of questions.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And this summer, or this year, the Farm Bill expires on September the 30th, so we got to reauthorize that. Also, the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, they have a 5-year, every 5 years they have to be reauthorized. And so we're in that process right now, and their reauthorization also expires on September the 30th, Nick. I'm on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee as well as the Agriculture Committee, but on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, I'm on the Aviation Subcommittee, which means that we've been having hearings. I've been very involved in looking at the FAA, how they're carrying out their tasks, what inefficiencies could be there, what's going on now, and how we can improve things moving forward as part of their reauthorization.
The COVID-19 origins have been something we've been talking about here, basically since we started this pandemic 3 years ago. We wanted to know why, and it looks like Congress at least is going to try to find out more, and you supported something in that regard earlier this month.
Yeah, that's right. So there was a resolution passed the House to declassify what we know about the origins of COVID. I feel like the government has not been forthright enough, has not been open about what we know on where COVID actually came from. Everything I've seen, it sure seems to me like it came from the Wuhan laboratory for a whole bunch of reasons. But resolution came forward. It actually passed unanimously out of the House to declassify what we know about the origins of COVID. Now it's over on the Senate side. Optimistic it'll move over there, and it's just far past time. I believe that this government, release what they know and is much more forthright and open with the American people.
All right. I think we may have spoken about this before because it was a proposal at the time, but the Biden administration's Waters of the U.S. rule came out, and so earlier this month you had a release on that. So basically, there's a court case that was ongoing, and what they're trying to figure out is what actually is a navigable waterway, and I hate that terminology because the ditch that runs by your field, unless somebody's going to put a sailboat in it made out of paper, I don't see how that's navigable. But what does this WOTUS rule mean, and how are you pushing back against it?
Well, Nick, and you're exactly right. So the Clean Water Act, and everybody's for clean water. But what's happened is the administration is defining the jurisdiction the federal government has due to the Clean Water Act would include, the current definition would include farm ponds, drainage ditches, way beyond the intent of the Clean Water Act. Obama rolled out a whole bunch of these Waters of the U.S. regulations. Trump rolled them back. Now Biden is in the process of working to push them forward. So we've been part of legislation to stop this from happening. This would be huge burdens for oil and gas producers. It'd be huge burdens for our real estate developers, big burdens for our ag producers, and a whole bunch of many people in our district. We also are working on language that would not fund the implementation of these rules. We've been fighting this in court. This has been a long, drawn-out effort to make sure that these overreaching regulations do not go into effect and do not negatively impact Kansans.
All right. We've talked about some of the ag-related pieces of President Biden's budget proposal, but what are some of the other areas that you say to yourself, we really need to push back against this and try to get the Republican Congress to, or I should say the Republican House, because the Democrats still have control of the Senate, to as appropriators do some different things than what the president has suggested?
Well, and what the president suggested was higher taxes on practically everybody. Also, the administration continues to want to increase the number of IRS agents that are working, that are on the job to harass mostly good and honest taxpayers, which the vast majority of folks in our district do not want to see. And it's just more spending, Nick, on crazy stuff. And frustrates me, there are things in the budget that are against how we've operated as a country for a long time. For example, there's been long-standing bipartisan agreement that we would not have taxpayer dollars go towards abortion. And it's called the Hyde Amendment. And the president's budget, does away with the Hyde Amendment and would have, if it goes through as proposed, would have taxpayer dollars going towards funding abortions. And this is not something that the overwhelming majority of folks in our district want to see happen. So a lot of bad things in this budget. We're working to parse through it, kill the bad stuff, and make sure it never becomes law and never impacts us.
All right. Tracy, one question about just the U.S. and China. The guy who's technically from Singapore, who was the TikTok CEO, testified before Congress on a different committee recently. But when you think about the U.S. and China and their relations and how that all impacts the agricultural economy and the big first district, what do you think your office needs to do to make sure that the interests of the folks here in Western Kansas are protected?
Yeah, great question. As I zoom out, Nick, when I look at our country, we're in 2023. The rest of this century, I think our three biggest threats as a nation are, one, we've drifted from our founding fundamental values. Two, it's our debt. And number three is China. And I feel like the Chinese have taken advantage of us for far too long. And it permeates everywhere. TikTok, there's been hearings on the CEO of TikTok was in Washington in front of the Energy and Commerce Committee last week. The surveillance abilities that the Chinese Communist Party has via companies based in China like TikTok, horrible for our national security. We have too many instances where you have Chinese non-Americans that own farmland, large tracts of land near some of our military installations. We don't see much of that in Kansas, but in West Texas and North Dakota, Montana, we've seen the Chinese buy up large pieces of land, so we are on legislation to stop that. The list goes on and on and on, but we've got to acknowledge that the Chinese are our adversary on the world stage. They are trying to dominate us, and we have our head in the sand, I believe, if we think otherwise.
It's easy to see a balloon in the air. It's awfully hard to see something filed at the Register of Deeds office, though, isn't it, Tracy?
Well, that's exactly right, and I feel like, in many ways, we have been too trusting, in some ways asleep at the wheel. I think, Republican or Democrat, folks would agree that President Trump's administration kind of woke America up to a large degree to how the Chinese have been taking advantage of us. And there's broad bipartisan support and acknowledgement of what's happening. The House, with the new Congress, established a new committee called the Special Select Committee on China. Really good committee, bipartisan, looking at what the Chinese are doing, how they're operating, how they're impacting our economy, how they're stealing our information, and there's going to be some really good piece of legislation. I'm optimistic they're going to come out of that effort as well.